having people ask, can you give me some copies of that material? Where did you get this stuff about the Migdal eater? I need somebody that got some time to do this kind of stuff, to mail all this stuff out to people, because I don't know how to do like a major file to do an email, or I don't know how to do that. And yeah, and so anyway. Okay, well, these guys say, when they say, can you get me a copy of that? And I wrote them back, said, yeah, what's your physical address? And they're like, what? What are you talking about, our physical address? They give me their email address. I don't know what to do with that. But anyway, in Luke chapter 2, hey, Sandy, how you doing? Good to see you, hon. Our personal family, I'm talking about my mom and dad and brother, our Christmas tradition, we always open our stuff on Christmas Eve. And Dad would always read the Christmas story out of Luke chapter 2. Well, as a kid, right, you're looking at your dad, and you know what's going to happen because it's happened every year all of your life, and you see the Christmas tree with your name on the boxes, and, you're like that, and Dad starts reading, and you just, can you do every other verse because you want to get to those? But I so much now appreciate what he did, and because we do this every year with our kids now and grandkids. But in Luke chapter 2, beginning of verse number 21, Scripture says, and when 8 days were accomplished for the circumcising of the child, Jesus was circumcised on day 8, as every Jewish boy was. And that was a sign of the covenant, that he was a Jewish boy of the covenant. And I love the fact that they did it on day 8, because on day 8, you have more prothrombin in your body than any other day of your life. That's your vitamin K count. That's part of the protein of the vitamin K chain. And it's a blood coagulant, kept you from bleeding to death. And so if you're a hemophiliac, what do they give you? What kind of shots? Vitamin K shots. And so the Lord knew that these little boys wouldn't bleed to death if they did that on day 8. Anyway, his name was called Jesus, which was so named of the angel before he was conceived in the womb. And when the days of her purification, according to the law of Moses. Now, she was unclean 40 days after Christ was born. It was 80 days for a girl. But when these 40 days were accomplished after the birth of Christ, according to the law of Moses, they brought him to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every male that openeth the womb shall be called holy to the Lord. And to offer a sacrifice according to that which is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of turtle doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, pigeons cost about 8 cents apiece. This was the poor man's offering. And so they brought Jesus to the temple and did all the things according to the law with the birth of this child. Well, you couldn't help but be impressed with the work and the genius of Michelangelo. If you ever have seen his work or maybe even been to Italy, his fingerprint is all over that nation, everywhere. The man was a genius. He was working on a sculpture on one particular occasion, and a friend dropped by to visit him and asked him, said, "Are you making any progress at all?" Because it didn't appear like he was getting anywhere. And Michelangelo said, "Well, I've been working on it day and night." And the guy said, "Well, doing what?" And he said, "Well, one day I spent the entire day working on a little finger." He said, "And the next day I spent the entire day working on a wrinkle on his forehead." And the guy said, "Why do you spend so much time on trifles?" And it was Michelangelo that made this famous statement: "Trifles make perfection, and perfection is no trifle." Remember that. Little things. And I am not a detail person. That's a weakness that I have. I like to do, I know that big things are the accumulation of small things. And so that's been a struggle for me through the years. But in the Christmas story, excuse me, you'll find a sequence of little things, just little incidences that are like the camera just zooms by and you don't get much time to look at it, but it's important in this story. For instance, God uses little people. How many great, big, famous people were used in the Christmas story? None. He uses little people. There were a lot of very famous people in Palestine in 6 BC. A lot of really, really well-known people. There were world-renowned scholars of the law of Moses. There were teachers. There were leaders. There were politicians. There were soldiers. This was a center of learning. Jerusalem was one of the brain trusts of the Mediterranean world. And but when the angels gathered to announce the birth of the Son of God, they didn't appear to the Sanhedrin. They didn't appear to the military contingents or the political guys. That was a group of shepherds who were watching their flock, which they did not do in the wintertime, by the way, outside. And so there were some shepherds, a very special group of shepherds, that were watching their flock by night. And the angel came and announced the birth of the Son of God. Now, one of the most intriguing things to me about the story of Christ is where he was born. And for many, many centuries, we have, taught in our nativity scenes and everything, have shown him in a barn behind a hotel. And, there were donkeys and camels and all kind of what would be considered, like nasty type animals that were there. That's not the case at all. Christ was born, according to the book of Micah, in a place called the Tower of the Flock. And the Tower of the Flock is translated the Migdal Eder, which means the Tower of the Flock. And just outside the city of Jerusalem, there was a birthing center for lambs. And this birthing center produced lambs that were used solely for sacrificial purposes in the temple. These were not just market lambs that were sold. And these men were highly trained birth specialists because these lambs could have no imperfection at all. When they were born, they were wrapped tightly in swaddling cloth to keep them from injuring themselves during the birth process. Then they were placed in a stone bed that was called a manger. And the lamb was there until he calmed down, and then they would feed that lamb and make sure that he was in perfect shape to go for sacrifice. And there were no places available for a family to spend the night, especially with a pregnant woman, who, by the way, in the first century, a pregnant woman didn't travel with just her and her husband. They didn't travel alone if she was expecting, especially if she was near her due date. It was very common for her aunts and her nieces and a contingency of female family members to go with her to assist in this birthing process. And so the chances are, and the Bible doesn't speak to this at all, but the chances are that there was a relatively good number of her female family members that came down from Nazareth to Bethlehem with them. But that being aside, this was the only place available, this birthing tower. Very unusual. That's why when the angel said, "There's going to be a sign to you." Well, sign is an unusual thing.
Can I point out a fact, Pastor?
Yes, sir.
What I've done study on is like the Old Testament, how it compares to the New Testament and stuff like that, and actually the gifts that they actually brought to the baby Messiah back in their days was actually the same materials that was used for sacrifices back in the Old Testament times.
Mm-hmm. And that's what these lambs were for. And so here's what I think is just a wonderful picture. The birthing center where sacrificial lambs were birthed, wrapped in swaddling cloth, put in a manger. Here, the Lamb of God was birthed, wrapped in swaddling cloth, put in the same manger that the other angels. Now, here's something that I just discovered in our last trip when we went with Buddy Rainey, and I wanted to go to the Migdal Eder because I knew that Christ was not born where most Christian, yeah, that I knew that was a delusion. Anyway, Eric and Ed arranged for us to visit the Migdal Eater. There's a stone wall built around it. Yeah, it was to be secluded. And I'll give you one guess as to who built the stone wall. There's a very big church over in that part of the world built the stone wall to keep people out because they didn't want attention and tourism taken away from their concession. Yeah. Yeah, so, they had their own concessions, their own spot, their own site going. Anyway, there was a hole in the wall, and we went in, and this was, you walk up to the edge, it was like a little drop-off. Not a little drop-off, it's probably 12, 15 feet. And it was like caves. And we said, can we go down in there? He said, yeah. So we picked our way down this little place and walked inside, and there were, several little rooms in there and just holes underground. Got back out, and the guy was saying to us, he said, we also have it on very good authority that this was the house of Jesse. And my head exploded. I was like, that's the house of who? I said, Jesse. David's dad? Yeah. And I'm not a mathematician, but instantly I was like, tick, 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 tick. Are you kidding me? Are you telling me that Jesus and David were born in the same house? And maybe even, of course, my story is the same bedroom. I'm not, if you're that close, I'm putting them in the same bedroom. And so just little things, little people that didn't mean a whole lot in the first century. Mary, Joseph, these shepherds, we don't even know their names. But could you imagine the stories that these guys got to tell to their children and their grandchildren, that I was there the night that the angel appeared and told us about that? And so when God needs a vessel, most of the time in history, and I'm sure that you've noticed this, he doesn't choose the great and the mighty. Now, sometimes he does. And it's not because they're great and mighty, it's because they're godly. David was a great and mighty guy, but he was a godly, great and mighty guy. And so here was Mary. She wasn't a member of the elite. She was a 14-year-old girl. 14-year-old women didn't have any clout at all in the first century. And there was nothing unusual about Mary other than she was a godly young woman. And she is not to be prayed to. She is not to be worshiped. She was just a clean young woman that the Lord said, there she is. That's the one. And Jesus chose his own mother, chose his own stepfather, who, by the way, was in line to be king of Israel. He was in the line of David, but turned out that he was a carpenter. And so the Lord was going to need an earthly mother to take care of him, and so he chose this young woman and would also need a dad. But, you were thinking, well, what great king, what great household would the Son of God be born in? The carpenter's house. He's going to learn how to saw wood and build stuff, and he's going to be, we won't even know his address. We don't know a whole lot about him.
That's
and
crazy at the same material you work with the same material that he was hung on.
Yeah. Who killed Goliath? David, a little shepherd boy. Who defeated the Midianites with 300 men? Exactly right. That's exactly right. Look, mighty man of what? Who? You talking to me? And so he doesn't often call the qualified. He qualifies the called. And exactly. It's not that we educate ourselves and build ourselves up to the point where God says, okay, now he's ready. It's normally we're just aware I'm not worthy of this. Who led Israel out of Egyptian slavery? Where a kid that was found floating down the Nile River. Now I realize that he became a relatively well-known guy. You remember how Naaman got healed of his leprosy? You remember he went to this big clinic, and these world-famous doctors were leprosy specialists. You remember that? Neither do I. I don't either. A little slave girl We don't even know her name. And she said, if you'll go down and dip yourself 7 times in the Jordan River. And you remember his initial response? Ha, Jordan River. Are not Arbana? Aren't the rivers of my country better than this one? And she said, well, they might be, but you're going to come out with leprosy. You go down and dip in that one. And he did, and came out clean. Now, who donated a lunch that fed about 20,000 people? Remember they had that catered? You remember? Jumart catered all of that, and they brought in wagon loads. No, it was a little guy that had one lunch, and but he was willing to give it, and he did. And the Lord gave fish that had never been caught. He gave bread that had never been baked. I don't know how he did it. I would have loved to have seen him just keep digging. Could you imagine the disciples standing around going, Where is that coming from, man? I mean, it was just one lunch. And as a matter of fact, there was so much. Were there any leftovers? How many leftovers? How many disciples or apostles or disciples were there? They had enough for everybody, and they took home some extra stuff, and I think quite possibly that little boy, could you imagine his mom? Him walking in the front door and like, what are you doing? Well, this is what's left over, Mom. Just small things, small people. How about small places? So, well, you got to live in New York to really do something. You got to have a big market. You got to be in Los Angeles. Hardy County. Everybody that calls me from out of state, wanting to sell me something, or we're having to do some kind of business. And where do you live, sir? Wauchula, Florida. Where? It's like, Wauchula? Who? What? Where is that? I don't know where this place is. Micah 5, verse number 2, tells that Christ would be born in Bethlehem. The Jewish scholars didn't know that. I don't know why, but it was just not generally known where Christ was going to be born. He wasn't born in Rome. He wasn't born in Babylon. He wasn't even born in Jerusalem. He was born in this little Wauchula. Yeah, probably Ona would be even better. Just this small, little, insignificant area that had approximately 300 citizens in the first century. Now, how many babies do you believe were born on the same night? Out of 300 people, how many children were born? What are the chances that might have been the only one? I think probably that was the only one. And so he appears in the most humble of places. He passed over the great cities. He passed over the great people. And he found this little girl, this 15-year-old girl, 14, 15-year-old girl that had chosen to be a virgin. And then there was Joseph that had chosen this young lady to be his. That says something about both of them. Well, they were insignificant people. And so he appears, well, everything that Jesus did, he had to borrow. He didn't even own a house. He couldn't invite the disciples over for dinner. He didn't have any church meetings. He didn't have a house. He even said, foxes have holes and the birds have nests. The Son of Man, I don't even have a place. I don't know where we're going to sleep tonight. And I'm sure that the disciples were very concerned about those, but Jesus didn't own anything. When he met for the final time with the apostles, where was that? It was a borrowed upper room. He didn't even have the building to do that. Where did he have this? Where did he feed this big 5,000? Remember that big auditorium? It's on a hillside. It's on a hillside. Y'all been there? I think you've been there. And did they send somebody down to the bottom of the hill? This was when he did the Matthew 5, 6, and 7. They went down and spoke up this hill. But he uses these places that were insignificant until he had something to do with them. This is the Sermon on the Mount, is what I was thinking about. Bethlehem was not famous but for one thing. 1,000 years earlier, another king was born there, David. 1,000 years later, a second king is born, Jesus. Those are the only two things that Bethlehem is known for. And wonderfully enough, the name Bethlehem means the bakery. So from the bakery came the bread of life. Just a small town, an insignificant place that, and is there that bakery still on I-4 over there coming into Lakeland? It used to be the Sunbeam Bakery? Is it still there? I remember as a kid, we'd be going to Tampa or coming, and you drive by that bakery, and you could, the bread just smelled. Doesn't Christ just, and I don't see how people live life without the bread of life. I don't understand that. Have you ever tried it? I have, and I'm sure that you have. It's just a tasteless, useless, defeated life. And so, as a matter of fact, when it was time for him to be buried, there was no pyramid. Oh, you know, the pharaohs, before they ever died, the crowning thing that they did in their administration, build a tomb. That's all they had to look forward to. And they'd build these great big ostentatious buildings called pyramids. And they'd bury these guys in there, and they were so arrogant that they buried their staff with them. They put food in there, and we have found the archaeologists have found green peas that were buried with these pharaohs like 4,000 or 5,000 years ago, and they planted them and they grew. And so it's pretty amazing. But anyway, this is a borrowed tomb. People don't borrow tombs, but if you're not going to be there very long, I suppose you could borrow a tomb. But there was a cave that was a comfort to David. That's where he hid on one occasion. Remember burning bush? Just it was a bush on fire, but it wasn't being consumed. How about a lonely island in the Mediterranean to give John so he could write the book of Revelation? It was just a scraggly penal colony is what it was. It's where you sent prisoners, kind of like Australia was back many years ago. How about a rooftop where Peter was shown, don't you ever call anything that I do unclean again? There's a fiery brick kiln that 3 Jewish young men learned about the power of God in. You remember that? It's a brick kiln. It was not one of the tourist attractions of Babylon. It was where they burned brick. They made brick in this thing. And it was large enough for 3 grown men, well, actually 4. Because that's what the king saw down in there. So our home, that we don't live in mansions. You know, our homes are not on the homes of the rich and famous. I've never had a TV crew come to my house, have you? And filmed how wonderful and magnificent and, oh my goodness, gold-plated this, that. We've never had that. I don't want that. But, you know, my home can be a place where Christ is exalted. Me, you, we're not famous. Not many people know our names, but does that really matter? You know, we can be the vessels through whom God speaks. Mary was pregnant for the standard 40 weeks, 9 months.
I've always told people that I can be the poorest man in life, but I can be the richest man in spirit.
Exactly right. That's exactly right. For 40 weeks, the systems required to produce a child were triggered in her by the angel, and Jesus developed in her. And then birth, and then we saw what God looked like in human form through this young lady who walked down this mysterious road of motherhood and basically walked into the jaws of death to give birth to the Son of God. And I think that is so symbolic of we can be the womb again that Christ has developed, and that his nature and his character is given birth to this culture today so that they can see what God looks like in the flesh again in our lives and through us. And so he uses little people, he uses little places and little things. I'm amazed as I read through Scripture, 5 loaves and 2 fish. Has any bread ever been more talked about than those 5 loaves. 2 fish. 2 dried, salted fish. I don't know of any 2 fish that have ever been more mentioned or more preached about than those 2 fish. Those fish should have been proud. Their moms and dads would have been proud had they known. How about the ox goad that Shamgar used to kill 600 Philistines? It was a stick with a pointed end on it. This guy used it as a weapon to kill 600 of God's enemies. Where is that stick? I don't have a clue. I don't know that it's in a museum somewhere. It probably is not. I've never even heard of any such thing. But how about a shepherd's staff in the hand of Moses? You remember what the Lord told him one time? He said, "What you got in your hand?"
I got that.
Yeah.
I got that at the National Museum.
Yeah. What's in your hand? So, it's a stick. A stick. Yeah. Hold it up. Throw it down on the ground. It's not a stick. In your hands, it's a stick. But let me have it. All right? So it's not what you own. It's not what you have. It's who owns that. And those 5 loaves and 2 fish, it was, when God owns what you have, it becomes more than you need. It really does. And people, it kind of breaks my heart. People bust their humps all of their lives to get what God wants to give them anyway when they're in the center of His will. And we lose our focus on things. And I love preachers, especially young preachers. And I try to do what I can in school and online to encourage these guys. Don't ever get caught up in the glitz of theological nightclubs. And that's kind of where we're swinging to today. We got the disco ball over the pulpit, and we got the lights flashing, and we've got the fog machines rolling out, and we've got this high energy music, and we're doing this pop psychology stuff to try to make people feel good about themselves, and try to get. It seems as though we've got this reactionary Christianity thing going on, where everybody's always trying to get out of trouble. And they want God to deal with their problems, but not with their sin. And we're accommodating that in churches. Where people come, and the doctrines of the Bible are almost ignored. It's almost like they're insulting today.
Or how about you bring your child to an activity at the church and they say you can't participate with your child unless you're a member?
Yeah. I'm just telling you that I'm grateful that God uses little people and little things and little moments and little parts of our time, and He uses little tasks. Worship is made up of the trifles of life. What I mean by that is this: these small, imperceptible, unnoticed, inconspicuous little acts of service and godly love that reveal the nature and the character of God. And there's so many people that think, well, worship is what you do at church. This is the only place you can do it. And I've told you for nearly 30 years, you don't go to church to worship. You go to church to continue worshiping. This is an accumulation of what we do all week. This is not the instigation of what we do. We don't start worship. If we start worshiping here, we're late. We're late. And so this is just the accumulation. And so when everybody brings, when you came in the door tonight, when I walked in, your life is like a cup. And whatever you are and whatever you have done, we pour it into the vessel of this service. And have you ever drank sour milk accidentally? You just accidentally, it's just like, it doesn't take long. Get rid of it. And, I've been in services when there was, and maybe I was the one that poured the sour milk into the vessel. But you can't come to a church service and think this is automatically worship. It was, as we've talked about this before as well, nothing in itself is automatically an act of worship. Nothing. Praying is not automatically an act of worship. Did at any moment in the New Testament Jesus ever chide people for the quality of their prayer? He did. Yeah. You guys, you stand on the street corners and you beat your trumpets and you pray these big nasty prayers with these great big words. And how about giving? Did he ever chide anybody for giving? He did. He stood by the treasury box in the temple, and the rich guys came by, and they had buku-doodles of money, and they threw in just some that never bit into their weekly budget. It was just some extra, just some pennies they found under the bed. We'll give that. And Jesus was not impressed with that. And then here comes this poor old widow woman. Didn't have a husband to take care of her, and she poured in her weekly budget, everything she had, and Jesus said she gave more than all you guys did. And so nothing in itself is an act of worship. And I think that contemporary Christianity has been so diluted by the wrong kind of preaching and leadership that you come here and you stand, you sing, you pray, you confess, you whatever you do, and you're good to go. You can live life any way you want to, but as long as you come here and scrub up, you're good to go. And I think we have done such a disservice to people in that. Then on the other hand of that, or the side of that coin, you're going to have to understand this in context. That's right. Anything can become an act of worship. Now, what I mean by context is anything that doesn't violate the character of God can become an act of worship. What did he say? Paul said, whether you what? Eat or drink or whatever. Whatever. What is part of whatever? Buying a car, going out to dinner, spending time with the family, going to work. That's part of the whatever. Whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. And the word glory means for the reputation of. So I need to always keep in mind that God's reputation is at stake with me. His reputation is at stake. Now, you understand that his reputation literally never is diminished because he's God. But I can diminish his reputation in the eyes of other people by what I do. And so when people look at me and they see, let's say I get drunk downtown publicly. I'm your pastor. What are people going to assume? I didn't know preachers could do that. Well, they're not supposed to. And you know somebody's going to say, well, if the preacher can do that, hold my beer. You know? They're going to, whatever I as a pastor do, or as a Christian, whatever we do, that's defining God in our culture. Now, I don't care if you're a teenager or if you're a mom or a grandmother, I need to always keep in mind and bear in mind that this is, I am the definition of God to somebody. And I don't want to misdefine God. And I can misdefine a lot of things. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yeah, that's a great point, and you're exactly right.
There's a lot of
you
people, too, that you got to be careful, too, about how you approach it, because very quickly there's so many people I know that the fire burns out.
Yeah,
And it takes a while to get it back.
it does, and that's a good point, too. And we were talking about this on the trip, as a matter of fact, how people get in a bind, and they're in some kind of a crisis mode. What was it, the movie The Green Mile? Was that Burt Reynolds? Was he? He was in a movie, and he was drowning. He was drowned. There was a movie where Burt Reynolds was drowning, and he was sloshing and going under and saying, "God, help me, help me, help me!" And he swam a little closer to shore. He said, "If you help me, if you get me out of this, I'll go to church the rest of my life." And got a little closer to shore, and he was like, "Well, maybe twice a month, you know." And he got a little. Finally, he got up on the beach and he said, "Never mind, I made it." And there are a lot of people when they're in crisis mode, they want God to deal with their problems, but they do not want their sin dealt with. And so I'm thankful that the Lord uses this church. It's not a huge church. This church has touched my life like you will never know. And this church has touched the lives of people around the world that we will never meet. Never meet them. I mean, you've had a part in that. Passing preachers that come through here. Every one of them, I think I can say without exception, have gotten back in touch with me and praised your character and your friendliness and your spirit every time. I mean, you can, and it doesn't take but one intersection with somebody to change their life. Just one. And if it's a positive intersection, that's going to last a long time. If it's a negative intersection, that's going to last a long time. It is. And so here in the Christmas story, we've got just some little people that if it weren't for the birth of Christ, we wouldn't even know them. We wouldn't even know anything about them. Little places that were not for the birth of Christ, we wouldn't even know about it. And so I'm glad God is careful to choose those vessels that are empty of any greatness for the most part. And when they're empty of that, they can be filled with His greatness. And what a joy it is. And so, yes, sir.
I know you've been over there usually in March, but then you would, the 2 March that I've been over there, it was cold. First when it snowed, about 6 inches this past year, we were bundling up. I remember Mount Olive, we were all bundled up. I've seen some pictures where people in shirt sleeves and that sort of thing. So I know it changes, but they're only about, I was just checking, Jerusalem only latitude of about Macon, Georgia, between Macon and Chicken, Georgia. So, far north.
Right.
But it gets cold.
It does. It get cold over there. Well, thank y'all for being here tonight. I appreciate it. And if you would put me and Stacy. We've got a busy day Sunday, and but I hope she doesn't come down with whatever going around town. Yeah, everybody doing okay? All doing well? Okay. Yeah. So, all right, we've got the viewing tomorrow night of Tim Cowart. It's going to be at Robarts from 6 to 8, and the funeral. I'm conducting the funeral at 10 o'clock Friday morning, and we've got lunch here about 12, I'm going to say 12:30, something like that. And you would be available? I will be here, and we can, would anybody else, any lady or any man for that matter, be available to help serve? I mean, it shouldn't take much. We just set the stuff up and let them come by buffet style. But if you can, he won't be here that morning, but it'll be unlocked.
I was supposed to ring the bell at Dixie at 10 o'clock for an hour.
Okay. So okay. All right. And okay. Well, TJ said they would get things cleared out and have it ready for us to. I don't think we need to decorate. It's kind of spur of the moment, and y'all are busy ladies and gentlemen, and so. That what? Oh, okay. Bless your heart. Okay. Okay. Just put it in the cooler back there then. All right, very good. Thank you, Anna. I appreciate that. And so on behalf of the Cowart family, thank you for what you're going to do. You already go to the house? Man. All right. Yes, sir. Yeah, so we've got a couple of weeks to heal up here. Oh, Devin and Nariah and the babies will be here Sunday. They're getting here. Stacy, if you're watching, forgive me. It's either Friday or Saturday. I think it's Friday. They're getting here this weekend, and so I'm going to check with him. And what would you think if I asked him if he'd want to speak Sunday night? Let him do that. The guy has turned into a really, really good thinker, and he spoke up at their church up there in Minneapolis, and they videoed it, and he sent me a copy of it, and it was really, really good. So anyway, I'll check see if he wants to do that. All right. You all ready to go home? All right. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And thank you for, I know November, December have been busy months. We've done a little more traveling than normally I do in November, December, but the Minneapolis thing looks like it's going to be a yearly thing as long as Devin is there. And this trip, I love to hunt, but I don't do any local hunting. There's basically no real good deer spots unless you're in a lease or get invited. But anyway, I enjoyed going out and where we went. And y'all know what happened? You know what we did? Okay, we got the 2 elk. Oh, you don't want to hear this? You don't want to hear this? Okay. Unplug her. Unplug her. Just turn her on. And